Hello, I'm Sharyl Attkisson, and welcome to Full Measure. We begin with the spread of terrorism 5 years after the Arab Spring. Attacks are happening around the world, and there's heightened concern about the potential for more. ISIS is now seen as the principal focus of the war on terror, a spot once held by al-Qaeda. In fact, 17 terrorist groups have been added to the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations in the past 5 years. And 2014 saw a record 16,800 global terrorist attacks. Several months ago, we began work to trace the global spread of terrorism since the uprisings known as the Arab Spring starting in 2010. Instead of resulting in a democratic revolution, the upheavals created the kind of chaos and vacuum that allowed terrorism to grow and thrive. Correspondent Scott Thuman landed in Beirut the day of two massive attacks by ISIS.
It is one of the last places you might imagine rooting for. A country steeped in a violent history, often at odds with America, where flags of terror groups line streets and banners of assassinated leaders drape buildings. But stability in Lebanon may be exactly what helps to keep America safe too, especially after this. Suicide bombers hit Beirut, killing dozens, wounding hundreds. Retaliation against the Lebanese group Hezbollah, which has been fighting ISIS in Syria. A day later, ISIS unleashes an even larger attack on Paris. Panic is widespread.
And I'm still feel shocked, even if I don't know, I really feel shocked because it could have been my family or my friends who were there, or me.
While it's easy for Americans to relate to what happens in France, those at the first bombing site say Americans should care just as much about what happens in Beirut.
I think what we're witnessing now is a dysfunctional state.
What could that mean in the fight against terror?
All terrorist organizations that would find a safe haven in some places in Lebanon and act with impunity and try to recruit more youngsters, brainwash them, push them to commit more suicidal attacks.
Lebanese political analyst and activist Eli Fawaz says if this sounds familiar, it should. The so-called Arab Spring that began 5 years ago, bolstering optimism from Tunisia to Egypt, Libya to Yemen and beyond, was a rallying cry denouncing leaders like Gaddafi and Morsi. But without structure or constitutions to build on, they collapsed. The voids were filled with terror groups seeking a worldwide caliphate. Some fear Lebanon is next.
The U.S. has a major role in stabilizing the country, but it's not doing so because the actual administration is basically moving away from the region. Now Syria is a vacuum. Now Yemen is a vacuum. Now Libya is a vacuum. Iraq is a vacuum. We have 4 countries that cease to exist in the Middle East.
Even in a place like Beirut, where they've learned to live with war for a very long time, what's happening right now is a new and worrisome challenge. If the United States doesn't intervene, if the United States doesn't beat ISIL, will Lebanon be overtaken?
Of course. You understand what I mean. When I say United States stop war, you know what I mean. All Arab countries, all the world, United States, she can stop war.
It's not exactly a linchpin holding the region together, but Lebanon and its clear path between Syria and the Mediterranean Sea is a strategic partner. The U.S. has sold hundreds of millions of dollars in warplanes and missiles to the Lebanese. Bassem Shab is a member of parliament.
Most of our equipment is American. Our training is American. And we are dependent on American aid to sustain most of the equipment.
And just as Lebanon relies on the U.S., Beirut has something to offer too.
What we can help with is human intelligence, because the Lebanese army and the internal security forces have people who are detained. There was a possible suicide bomber who was detained in Tripoli.
It is not the first time America has invested weapons and personnel in the country. This, what looks like an industrial park today, 32 years ago was the site of the deadliest attack against U.S. Marines since Iwo Jima, when Hezbollah militants set off a truck bomb at the Marine barracks, killing 241 Americans.
U.S. forces about 5 months later withdrew from that peacekeeping mission, and the fighting continued for another 7 years. More than 100,000 people died in that conflict.
Is anyone actually suggesting the U.S. put troops back into Lebanon to protect the border from ISIS?
No, and that member of parliament told me despite some heavy fighting on the border, they are holding strong. Nevertheless, the White House said it is sending more resources to Lebanon. We can only imagine that means more money and more weapons.
Interesting. Thanks, Scott Thuman. In the days following the attacks, concern and rhetoric turned toward the issue of refugees. In October, from refugee camps in France, we reported on the potential for ISIS terrorists to travel into Europe posing as refugees. This week, a majority of U.S. states have said they will not allow refugees from Syria into their borders due to security concerns. But are Syrian refugees the largest threat when it comes to ISIS infiltrators? Jim Hansen is with the Center for Security Policy, a former member of U.S. Army Special Forces and author of Cut Down the Black Flag, a plan to defeat the Islamic State. In terms of threats, I know that Border Patrol agents and FBI agents are very concerned about the southern border.
Well, we've essentially got an unlocked open door and a welcome mat down there. So if I'm an ISIS guy who wants to come to the United States and wreak some havoc, I could either go through the screening, which the FBI director says isn't good enough, and at least face the U.S. government, or I could walk in and talk to nobody. I mean, if I'm looking at that, I know which one is the easier of the two, and that should scare Americans because there is no security down there.
Are there current threats because of that and other factors that exist in the United States? We keep hearing about pockets of refugees that have joined communities and are being recruited or possibly radicalized.
Well, if you look at places, Minneapolis, Dearborn have large Muslim migrant populations that have not assimilated. And then you look at Boston, the Tsarnaev brothers, who blew up the Boston Marathon and killed a bunch of Americans, came in as the kids of asylees. They weren't refugees, but pretty close to the same thing. And they went to a mosque in the Boston area that had 12 jihadis associated with it. People have been arrested for terror financing or, like the Tsarnaevs, actually killed Americans in terror acts.
I think if you ask people, Americans, what is our policy, what is our strategy now, they wouldn't be very clear on it. It seems to be evolving. What would you say it is?
I would say President Obama isn't very clear on our strategy to have one that looks like he wants to win. I mean, at this point, he seems to be perfectly okay with kicking the can down the road and letting somebody else deal with it. In this case, Vladimir Putin, the neighborhood bullies in town, and now the French are actually leading from the front and bombing a bunch of targets that for some reason we couldn't find for the previous weeks. Those fuel trucks were there. Those command and control centers were there. We just didn't have the will to hit them.
Thanks so much, Jim Hansen. Appreciate it. Coming up next on Full Measure, this woman says fighting fires was easier than battling discrimination at work. Her account may startle you, partly because of where it took place.